Welcome to the first IAHR webinar on the study of religion in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm Taves. I am a professor, actually now Professor Emeritus and Research Professor of Religious Studies, University of California at Santa Barbara, and the Vice President, one of the two Vice Presidents of the International Association for the History of Religions. In the absence of our president, Tim Jensen, I'll just make a couple of comments picking up on themes that I think he was planning to stress, which is to point out that we're holding this webinar in light of the pandemic that I'm sure everyone has heard of, that led to the cancellation of the 2020 Congress that was going to be held at the University of Otago in New Zealand. And three of the four speakers today were the host team for that meeting, the local hosts. So Will Sweetman, Ben Schonthal, and John Shaver. And John and I, with Ben, were actually also then the program committee for the Congress. And so I'm sure one of the things that Tim would want to do would be to thank the organizers for all the work that they did. And any of you who are listening to this who submitted papers, planning to present, planning to attend, for all the work that you did. In the wake of the cancellation, we had to scramble to figure out ways to preserve something of what went on or what we planned for that meeting. And especially, we decided that we wanted to at least highlight something of what is going on in terms of study of religion in New Zealand, which is something that all of us would have learned more about had we been able to attend the Congress. Our first speaker is going to be Paul Morris, and I guess I should say each of them is going to offer reflections for about 10 minutes. And then when that's done, if I have any brilliant observations to make in terms of a response or anything, I will try to offer that. But then we'll be opening the floor for conversation and discussion. So as I said, our first speaker is Paul Morris, who is Emeritus Professor of Religious Studies at Victoria University of Wellington. He held, may still hold, the UNESCO Chair in Interreligious and Intercultural Relations. He's particularly well known as the author of the New Zealand National Statement on Religious Diversity, and that's a topic on which he is known both for his writing and his public comments to the media. He's held visiting positions at a number of universities, including the University of California at Santa Barbara, and Oxford and elsewhere as well. So over to you, Paul.
Okay, unmuted. Kia ora. It's lovely to see faces I haven't seen for a while. Hi, Chris. Hi, Ben. And hello, Will, who I haven't seen. And John's disappeared, but he's there. What I want to do in my 10 brief minutes is to offer a very brief introduction to the study of religion in New Zealand, and then a few more general comments about the study of religion. The immediate context of my remarks are the intense pressures on universities in this region, in Australia and New Zealand, where a combination of existing restructuring plans, loss of overseas student income, and what I call coronavirus opportunism has led to an intensification of the devaluing of education in humanities and social sciences, announcements of academic position losses, and in some places a rather dramatic re-centralization and restructuring of the management and organization of academic work. Today in New Zealand universities, there are currently union and staff action at 3 of the 8 universities, and there may well be more to follow. New Zealand's a tiny country. I thought I'd take this opportunity as I was the first one of 5 million, with a largely state-funded and run higher education or university system. Until 1962, there were 6 university colleges under the rubric of the single University of New Zealand. There are now 8 nominally independent universities subject to the Tertiary Education Commission. The history is important because there was a non-duplication plan. So while anthropology developed at Auckland, sociology developed at Wellington, and so there's a historical legacy to the University of New Zealand. Until last year, there were about 170,000 university students, about 130,000 FTEs, full-time equivalents. 16% of the students are overseas, 11% Māori, 8% Pacifica, and about 30% are postgraduates. About 40,000 graduates a year, 90% of them plus are at the first degree level. Lincoln University doesn't have religious studies. Auckland University of Technology has a number of people who work in this area, but no religious studies. The University of Canterbury, which was the first to offer courses, but not a degree in religious studies, had a small, vibrant department that was closed in the early 2000s. There's no religious studies currently there, although a number of individuals publish in the religious studies field, although not one of them does so exclusively. University of Waikato had a small religious studies department, now closed, but does have a number of anthropologists and expert in Melanesian religions, and a number of others who have religious studies interests. Massey University, good morning, Chris, with 3 campuses around the country, does have a number of academics, and last year announced the Massey University Religious Studies Network, which when I spoke to someone who's organizing the network, is initially for research, but may have some future teaching implications. There are a number of Vic graduates who teach at Massey and are part of the network, and there are a number of courses, but no program that could be deemed to fall into the religious studies program. Are you still teaching the Crusades, Chris? Maybe, I can't hear him. The University of...
Sorry, I was going to answer your question, but I was muted.
Okay.
Well, sad news. I was teaching the Crusades from both sides, Crusades and Jihad. It's now been taken over by somebody who's taken out the Jihad. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Unfortunately.
Okay. Less religious studies at Massey. The University of Auckland has a BA in Theological and Religious Studies, a Master of Theology, and a PhD program. It has, and it's going to be the theme I'm going to come back to in just a moment, a very intersectional array of course offerings. And in its own words, courses include religion and justice, gender roles, and communities. It offers a major and minor. It's got a very limited array of courses, a compulsory course on studying religion, 2 other 100-level courses, one on the Bible, one on Islam taught by a sessional teacher. There are 5 courses offered at the 200 level. They're also taught at the 300 level. Recognizable courses in early Christianity, religion, sexuality, and gender, religious texts of terror, film and television. There are also directed study courses and a 3rd-year method course. The courses are, as I said, very, very minimal. There are currently 2 full-time religious studies dedicated staff, both in the Christian studies area, a joint appointment with Asian studies, the current NZASR president, and a PhD teaching fellow, PhD student who's a teaching fellow. There are also a number of courses in classics and anthropology which can be included in the major and minor. The University of Otago did have a religious studies and theology program. More recently has split with theology heading for humanities and the new religion program, the first in the country religion, that American designation, in social sciences. It has one full-time and one part-time professor, an associate professor, a teaching fellow, a number of sessional teachers, a senior lecturer, and a lecturer. It offers an impressive array of courses with a very heavy emphasis on Asian religions, religion and evolution, and some concentration in the Pacific. Victoria has two senior lecturers, one associate professor, one lecturer, and again, sessional teachers. The emphasis is there on largely on thematics in religion, and which draw on religion in Aotearoa, and a little on Asian religions. There are two staff teaching in that area, and an increasing number of courses which are explicitly social and cultural studies courses, the new location for the program, with a focus on anthropological and sociological studies of religion in Aotearoa. That is really it for the country. There are academics at Vic and Otago and elsewhere, as I said, who are not in religious studies but teach in the religious studies area. For arguments, for an example, there is a lecturer in politics who is currently working on conversion to Islam in New Zealand, and teaches Islam and politics. And beyond all that, when there are difficulties with location, there's the wonderful Joe Bulbulia, who's left religious studies and religion and theological studies at Auckland, and is now at Vic, but in the Department of Psychology, or in the psychology program. So not everyone fits, as my kind of argument. It is a very small array nationally, and the Fs and staff and student numbers are comparatively small, but ticking over. Having said that, the array of work is incredibly impressive, and in the religion evolution area, in the Asian studies area, and religion in New Zealand area. And specifically to add to that is expertise in Asian religions and politics. So I think there is real talent, although it's a comparatively small pool. And at least in Otago, the academics who work in Asian religions also seem to endlessly take on administrative positions, and so they obviously have other expertise alongside their academic. Now, what I want to talk about now is just the intellectual climate for a few minutes. And the language I alluded to before was intersectionality in religion. And this is increasingly dominant with religion and its location in the humanities and the social sciences. It's very evident looking at recent journals, which I did earlier this morning. In the top religious studies journals, about 50% of the articles fall into what I call religion and intersectional studies, or intersectionality. The idea that I'm trying to promote here is that religion is located on an oppression scale, and religion is taught in relation to oppression scale, and is very often taught in terms of some implicit notion of social justice. This has I think very dire implications for the study of religion, and makes teaching religion, such as my teaching of religion and argument, very, very difficult. Thematics like colonialism are difficult to posit. Religion is positioned by other students in the social sciences, and the situation at its best becomes apologetics or disengagement. Now, and I don't even want to talk about teaching Judaism in relation to intersectionality because it raises all sorts of issues. What it leads to is a kind of flattening and impoverishment of the past. I just want to read you a very recent statement, just as an example of this sort of intersectionality. This is from Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, last week of the United Nations. He writes, "The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrates what we all know. Millennia of patriarchy have resulted in a male-dominated world with a male-dominated culture which damages everyone, women, men, girls, and boys." Now, I have to say he was addressing the UN Commission on the Status of Women. So, I mean, it was a very particular audience. But if we are reduced to seeing everything in terms of scales of oppression and modes of oppression, we do religious studies, I think, very, very badly. The double danger there is that these people who work in this area and draw on this current dominant intellectual framework add little to our study of intersectionality or our critique of intersectionality. As I said, they're either apologetic, religion isn't as oppressive as we think it is, or they tend to claim a critical appraisal, but end up critically affirming a kind of intersectional climate or framework. And what is clear, there's a particular subcategory, which I won't have time to go into, but we can, but the older Foucauldian notion of resistance is still very widely favored in the study of religion, and its intersectional critique is often not fully appreciated. But religious studies is obsessed with colonialism, with empire, with gender, with issues of religion and race. The issue about this one-way rather than two-way interdisciplinary nature is that religious studies scholars don't add a great deal to the interdisciplinary framework. I mean, in terms of core ideas, I mean, or things which are taken up. And so it's a very, very particular audience, although there are some areas where that's less evident than others. I just tried to read Brent Smith's Religious Studies and the Goal of Interdisciplinarity, and his conclusion is that religious studies shouldn't try and make a contribution because the inherited framework of interdisciplinarity needs challenging itself. Back to religious studies in New Zealand, we have a very, very particular issue here because of our political climate. And so I remember when I spent some time at UQ, Lynn Hong in Queensland taught the most popular course in the Studies of Religion department there, which was on Aboriginal spirituality. In New Zealand, it's incredibly difficult for the indigenous spirituality to feature in religious studies departments, and there are currently no Māori academics employed in a position in religious studies. There is some research collaboration, but it also speaks to the climate in New Zealand, where the last census shows that nearly half of people who declare themselves to be Māori also declare themselves to have no religion and see their identity. I've just completed a survey for the Ministry of Education, and the vast majority of the Māori participants see tahawaira, see Māori Ritenga or Māori Tikanga as cultural. and not as religion. And the significance of this is that there is a whole area of research in terms of religion in New Zealand, which doesn't feature in our academic program. And it doesn't feature politically because it's not acceptable for non-Maori to do this work, but it also doesn't form a very significant part of what we do. As I said, I think that what's true internationally is true nationally. New Zealand has made a large and promising investment in religion, particularly in religion and evolution, and the use of biological and psychobiological models for cultural evolution. And potentially, they are the antithesis of intersectionality, although this isn't where the emphasis, the strength has been put. I think there is it's a critical time. This intersectional domination there is a real need to find a place for religion, and I want to end just by talking about the things that need to be done. One, as I said, is the understanding of religion in New Zealand and culture and the division between them, not in a kind of John Shaver way, but in terms of our little understood civil religion. I'm working on a project at the moment on religion and ethnicity in New Zealand, trying to give a more segmented account of New Zealand religion and where it intersects with ethnicity, and in terms of migrational waves. The history of religions is the history of diversity, and one of the things that this has generated for me is thought about the nature of schisms, new elite orders, new constituencies. And I feel at the very heart of religious studies are little understand dynamics of the ways in which diversity, internal and external, interreligious and interreligious, impact on religious development. The comparative study of religion is really not done in New Zealand, and that may be a good thing. And globally, I read Bruce Lincoln's book earlier this year, and where the aim is to drop big comparison for micro comparison, but it doesn't actually engage very fully in the model or the way I've tried to look at the limitations of much contemporary study of religion. That's really all I want to say. I just want to quote from a thesis that's recently been awarded at Victoria. And it starts off just by saying that my main method is using intersectionality as an analytical tool. It's a social science thing. And the entire thing is dominated by exactly the thematics that I've been referring to. The last thing I want to say is that the political dimension of this has real implications with at Victoria, the Turkish embassy opposing Greg Barton from Deakin speaking at Victoria, the Chinese embassy very upset about the visiting Prime Minister of Tibet, and we had to cancel a public meeting with Daniel Pipes and make it into a private meeting. And so cancel culture is very, very evident in our own intellectual scene and part and parcel of the kind of modes and hierarchy of oppression that I've been referring to. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. That was definitely quite comprehensive as an overview. Oh, and I see people have found their little hand clappers. That's very nice. Our next speaker is going to be Will Sweetman. He is a professor of Asian religions at the University of Otago, which you just heard has several people, two of whom you're going to be hearing from, who specialize in religions in Asia. Will, in particular, focuses on India and interactions between religion in India, particularly Hinduism, and the West in the modern period. He's edited a number of books and written a number of articles in that area. Before I turn it over to him, Will, just remind me what you'd like me to do on the timing here. Ben indicates that you and Paul probably have more that you plan to say, and I should let you guys run a little bit longer than the supposed 10 minutes. Do you want me to monitor the time? Or
you can give me a reminder after
hold
10 minutes, but I'll try and keep to time.
Okay, I'll start waving my hand
All right.
or hold up my iPhone when 10 minutes is up.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you, Anne. And I want to begin also by thanking Tim and Satoko in particular, along with Anne and the other members of the IAHR Executive Committee. First of all, for having the confidence in us to believe that we could host the IAHR Congress, and for all the help and support that they have given us through that process. They really were outstanding to work with. And I'm grateful also that for the suggestion of this webinar, where we can talk a little bit about what we had hoped would be one of the outcomes of the Congress, which would be to give people an insight to how we do the study of religion here, and to give something of a boost to the discipline here by allowing our colleagues in other fields in New Zealand to see the wider networks that we are part of, which of course they very rarely see because usually we're going somewhere else to participate in those events. Now I'm an outsider to New Zealand. I sometimes have the honor of being mistaken for a New Zealander. It was apparently said at in the committee that appointed me here, somebody expressed a view, I haven't found out who, that I had the perfect personality for New Zealand, which I've always taken as a great compliment. But I don't have the depth of knowledge of the context in New Zealand. But I do think and I've occasionally wondered why anybody would be interested in this area or in this webinar. But I've been reading recently, there was an exchange of views, I think mostly between Marcus Davidson and Kokke von Stuckrad about the study of religion in the Netherlands. And I've been reading that exchange and have found it very interesting to compare what is a relatively small scene there and the kind of debates that they've had, a different history, of course. So I hope this will be useful for some people. As I said, I'm an outsider to New Zealand. Having come here, what struck me about New Zealand was, in relation particularly to religion and the study of religion here, is the sense in which I think the discipline here is somewhat accidental. Paul talked about this approach when there was a single University of New Zealand to non-duplication and making sure that certain subjects were only taught in certain areas. I think we had a similar in the South Island. I think anthropology was taught at Canterbury and not at Otago, and sociology here and not at Canterbury. So there was the same kind of thing. But the study of religion, as Paul mentioned, has emerged in various places here. What strikes me about that process is how much it's depended upon individual initiative, and that there hasn't actually been I don't know whether religion or religious studies or the academic study of religion had any part in that under the University of New Zealand. It really didn't exist under the University of New Zealand. So clearly it wasn't thought of as something that is essential for a university to have. And I think that's probably still true in that we're not thought of as an essential discipline in the way that you couldn't imagine a university, at least one which had a humanities division, without history or without English. But it's quite obviously possible to conceive of a university without a department dedicated to the study of religion. So where religious studies has emerged in New Zealand, it's tended to be as a result of local circumstances, local initiatives, and it's also tended where religious studies departments have closed, and a number have closed in the 16 years since I've been in New Zealand. That's also been because of individual decisions. So Canterbury had 4 people, and then 1 left. I think the other retired, and the result was the department became unviable, and the individuals who were in the department made the very sensible decision to disband the department, and for each of them, one was a sociologist, the other an anthropologist, to revert to the larger departments in those areas. And I know that it'll be very interesting to see what happens at Auckland. Joseph Ubulia has decided to return to Victoria and to move to psychology. Again, there are good reasons for that decision, but it will be interesting to see what impact that has on what is a kind of fledgling department at Auckland. Auckland's history is very interesting. Again, the sort of accidental emergence of religious studies there. My understanding is that when religious studies was burgeoning elsewhere, both in New Zealand and around the world, the philosophers at Auckland resisted the introduction of religious studies because they thought it would be a Trojan horse for theology, which they strongly wanted to resist. Ironically, what happened, that I think was in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, in the 90s when there was a reorganization and theology, which was taught in seminaries in New Zealand, became unviable, Auckland took over some of the theological provision in Auckland. Auckland University took over the theological provision. And so theology appeared, but again, not by plan, rather by accident. And then a few years later, again, because of I think the views of the staff, those 2 staff who remain at Auckland, my understanding is that they felt that they would be more happy teaching religious studies than continuing to offer a theology degree. So there's been a very kind of accidental kind of process, I think, in New Zealand. And that underlies a kind of fragility, I think, of the discipline here. We're a small university system, and religious studies departments have always been small. I think the really outstanding exception to that was Vic, which at one point I think had 8 full-time tenured or permanent staff in religious studies, but has not been able to sustain that. And so the conclusion that I've come to is that for those of us in the discipline, we are going to remain to a large degree dependent on what happens with individual people and the decisions that they make. When somebody leaves a department, there's not a guarantee that they will be replaced. And there are, I think, almost no established chairs. There may be one at Vic, although there is not currently a professor at Vic. But there's no guarantees really in our discipline. And I think what we need to do in response to that is we don't have a lot of room for grand visions. We can't set out, what we think a pedagogically and intellectually coherent vision of the study of religion is, and hire, as the Germans can, 5 postdocs and a professor and establish 15 PhD places and really get a massive program going. We have to do what we can. And in New Zealand, that's hampered by the fact that there is, I think, a significant degree of disinterest in religion. I mean, as an outsider, again, I would say one of the things that strikes me about coming to New Zealand, there was a somewhat controversial book. It was a kind of provocative work, I think, published in the 1970s called The Passionless People. And it had this idea that New Zealanders were happy but somewhat kind of complacent people. I think smiling zombies was a term that was used. And I don't know how far that's true of the New Zealand character in general, but certainly I think in relation to religion, it often strikes me that there are, of course, a smallish number of people who are very passionate about their religion here. But for the rest, religion is not really a matter of almost any interest. To most people in New Zealand that I encounter, their feelings about whether you are religious or not, or whether you are one particular religion or another, are of no more significance than whether you like strawberry ice cream more than chocolate ice cream. It really does seem to be, and that's compounded by the fact that religion is not really taught in schools here. What there is in schools is mostly religious instruction. That's a matter of some political debate, and there are moves afoot now. I think Paul can maybe say more about this in the discussion, about trying to introduce a more religious study style curriculum, as we find in the UK and in other countries, into the schools here. But because of the lack of that, students come to university with really no expectation, no understanding of what religious studies is or what it is to study religion academically. And that's a big hurdle for us to get over. I think once we get them in the classroom and expose them to interesting questions about the way that religion helps shape political debates or has played a part in the evolution of societies or those kinds of things, we can get them over that hurdle, but the hurdle is there. They don't come with an interest in it. There's no career trajectory for people studying religion in schools to go on at university to go on and teach religion in school, for example. So what I've tried to do, and what I think the discipline needs to do in New Zealand, is to establish little bulwarks, things that can buttress our fragility. And I'm 2 minutes to go at. Examples of this is a very recent one, which has just come out of Vic. Vic have received a donation and are seeking further donations to establish a scholarship named after Sir Lloyd Gearing, who was professor at Vic, to provide for postgraduates. And I think that's an excellent initiative, because it's something that if the scholarship is dedicated to religion, then if they're able to establish that in perpetuity, then that's a tiny bulwark which will secure some kind of ongoing study of religion at Vic. We've had some similar initiatives here. Some of those have been successful. Probably the most successful one is the Albert Moore Memorial Lecture, again named for a founder here. We have a small amount of money there, which is sufficient to provide for an international visitor probably every year to come and give a lecture on religious studies. Some of the other things that we've tried, some of us at Otago made an effort just a little over a decade ago to establish a journal for religious studies in New Zealand. We couldn't do that on our own, so we did it in collaboration with colleagues in biblical studies who had a religious studies approach, I think. We ran that for about a decade, but it was a struggle. We had valiant support from people in religious studies, both here and overseas, but in the end, it never became self-sufficient. My idea for that journal was that it would provide an outlet for young scholars, early career scholars, to publish, to edit, even to provide, again, ballast on their CVs and so on. But as I said, some of these things have been successful and some haven't. But I think that's what we have to do. We will remain fragile and dependent upon the decisions of individuals and the whims of universities and their leadership. But we have to do what we can to establish those kinds of bulwarks. One thing that's interesting in the current context is at Otago, we have always attracted a very high proportion of international students, particularly study abroad students from America. And I suspect that's because they are much more familiar with the idea of the academic study of religion in a university context. And the loss of those students, at least for the second half of this year and at least for next year, is a kind of adversity, fairly minor in itself, but that can, when you've got fragile departments, if somebody were to leave in the middle of that and our student numbers were to take a dip, that's the kind of thing that could, lead to the wreck of it. That's how fragile I think our departments are, and how important it is that we try and find ways of shoring them up as much as we can. That's me.
Oh, I'm turned on. Okay. Well, thank you, Will. Really appreciate it. And yes, find your little clappers there. So our next speaker is Ben Schonthal, who is associate professor also at the university. Oh, John, are you next?
I thought so, but it.
Oh yeah, no, I think you're right. I just put you down on my sheet in a different order, and I was okay. Never mind. Our next speaker is John Shaver, who is, well, senior lecturer in religion and head of the religion program at the University of Otago, but we hope his status is elevated soon. He is in, I say that only because I know he's up for review, and anyway, wishing him the best on that. Anyway, he is an evolutionary anthropologist whose research applies evolutionary theory to understanding complex relations between religion, cooperation, and social inequality. As an anthropologist, he has conducted research in Fiji and Mauritius, and he's collaborated widely with scholars in both the Czech Republic and the US and other parts of the world. His work primarily appears in journals because it's more scientifically oriented, which is where those kind of people publish. Okay, John.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Tim and Satoko, for organizing this. So I thought, you know, Will and Paul have a better idea about the history of religious studies in general in New Zealand. So I thought what I would do is try to better answer a question that Wesley Wildman posed to me at the AAR, I believe last year, although it could have been the year before. He said something to me like, John, what's going on in New Zealand? You have all of these great people doing evolutionary and cognitive studies of religion. And I don't think I answered his question very well at that time, so I'll try to do a better job here. So what I'm going to do is briefly address the history and rapid growth of these kinds of approaches to the study of religion here. I think there are 3 events that are worth noting. The first and probably the most significant is the arrival of Joseph Bobolia to New Zealand. The second is the interest in the study of religion by external funders and researchers from outside of religious studies. But that does pose problems. I think it adds to this precarity that Will was speaking about. And the third is the use of large-scale databases to test long-standing questions in religious studies. Indeed, these 3 things are not mutually exclusive. Joseph Bobolia is involved in all of them. And I actually thought when this started, I should have made a photo of him be my background. Because if I'm going to talk about these approaches, it's really all Joseph. So Joseph arrived here in 2000, and he did not have his PhD, and he only had a book review. But I would like to note how important Paul has been in the growth of religion, the sort of flourishing of religious studies in New Zealand, because he, along with whoever was a part of Vic at that time, had the foresight to hire somebody who was doing this sort of unique kind of research in religious studies. And even Joseph's advisor, Jeffrey Stout at Princeton, sort of encouraged him to get away from this stuff, but Joseph persisted, and Paul saw the value in this. And not just with Joseph Bobolia, I could be wrong about this, this is just what Joseph told me in a text yesterday, but he also hired Rick Weiss, who was ABD with no publications, and is now associate professor at Vic, and Michael Radich, who didn't even have his MA, who's now an endowed chair at Heidelberg in Buddhist studies. So Paul really had this ability to find these fantastic scholars really early in their career and to build that department at Vic. It also signals how different the academic climate is now. We are currently hiring a 3-year fixed-term position. We have 77 applicants. I don't think we can consider anyone who doesn't have any PhDs, and indeed almost all of the applicants have several publications. So the academic climate is very, very different in just those 20 years. To return back to Joseph, he's now regarded as one of the founders of evolutionary religious studies. In fact, within religious studies, he's one of the most significant, or if not the most significant. And Joseph's career trajectory is interesting because if you follow him, you can kind of follow the path of these kinds of approaches. So Joseph his training was largely philosophical. And so his early papers and the foundational papers in the field were theoretical. And so he had 2 big publications in 2004 that laid out some of the key theoretical papers in the field. But then he began to, because he is Joseph Bobolia, he just began to learn things that were different and do them really, really well. So he taught himself statistics. And he then began to work with people from outside of religious studies, and he learned from them how to do experimental approaches and fieldwork approaches. And these collaborations, him with his training in religious studies and his classical training with these collaborators, and him learning from them and them learning from him, produced a lot of publications. Joseph has well over 100 publications now. But they produced these publications that had wide-reaching audiences outside of religious studies. And I think that has brought a lot of attention to New Zealand in sort of non-traditional ways. In particular, Joseph became involved in the New Zealand Attitudes and Values Study, which now has over 40,000 participants. And it's unique in its ability to, because it's longitudinal, address long-standing questions like what happens after a natural disaster? Do people become more religious? Does it help? So the Christchurch earthquakes here, the study had started prior to those, and so Joseph was able to look at these things along with Chris Sibley. As I alluded to earlier, something else that's happened in the last, I would say, less than 20 years, 15 years or so, is that people outside of religious studies have been, in New Zealand, have been interested in the study of religion. Notably Jesse Baring, Quentin Atkinson, Russell Gray, Jamin Haverstad, Ron Fisher, and Chris Sibley. And now there are some new people such as Rita McNamara at Victoria. But another thing that happened at this time was that external funders, maybe because these people began to be interested in religion, and we saw big publications coming out in high impact journals, external funders saw the value of investing in these things. So that allowed for Joseph Bobulia to get a Marsa Royal Society of New Zealand Marsden grant, which is sort of the equivalent of a National Science Foundation grant in the United States. And that enabled him to bring me here. And subsequently, I was able to get a grant from the Templeton Foundation, which enabled us to bring Joseph Watts here. So by virtue of the external funders' interest in these areas, we were able, our department has grown. I'd also like to note what Will signaled, that it's individual initiative. I believe there was a point in time when Will was the only member of religious studies at Otago, and now we have 4 permanent staff and 9 total staff or something like that. So Will has really been able to grow this department tremendously. And then one other thing that I would like to point out is, as Paul mentioned, this sort of intersectionality and the widespread approach to what less favorably could be called grievance studies, rears its head here in New Zealand. But I was trained in anthropology, and one of the things that really surprised me is, I think Ben pointed out after I gave a talk once, John, you need to stop apologizing for the first 5 minutes of your talk. So I was sort of saying, well, don't worry, I'm going to use some numbers. I realize that religion is complicated and this is fairly reductionistic. And but here I was given freedom to have these approaches in a religious studies department that I had never had in an anthropology department. And I think that sort of climate of tolerance of all kinds of approaches has allowed for the growth of evolutionary and cognitive approaches. And then I think because there have been 2 projects in particular, one, the New Zealand Attitudes and Values Study, which I just mentioned, but also Pulotu, which is a large database of Pacific religions that was built by Joseph Watts through a grant, a Royal Society of New Zealand grant to Russell Gray and Joseph Bobulia, is fantastic in its approach and has resulted in publications in journals such as Nature and Proceedings of the Royal Society, which are the most prestigious journal for any field. But because Joseph has been involved in those, and Joseph provided a lot of the theoretical background, although these sort of phylogenetic approaches are the computational phylogenetic approaches are unique in religious studies and unknown in other parts of the world, it allows researchers here to address longstanding questions of concern, but to broad audiences who may not have been interested in religion initially. So I think those are the three reasons why these approaches have made New Zealand recognized as a place where fantastic things are happening in this area. Although I want to conclude with sort of three things that I hope for in the future, and sort of concerns that things may not remain this way. The first is sort of what Paul pointed out, which is that we don't have a lot of diversity here. Joseph Watts and I study the Pacific a little bit, but we do so in very general ways. And we have no Maori intellectuals in religious studies departments, nor do we have anyone focusing on that content. But more broadly than that, we don't have much general diversity in terms of the staff. And so I think that's really important, that we have change. The second is more careful scholarship as it pertains to religion. So one of the reasons why the projects that have been successful, that have gained international attention, have had the attention that they've had, is because Joseph's been involved, and because he has sort of maintained this religious studies focus. But as people from outside of religious studies continue to publish in these areas, when they aren't trained in religion, often I'll read things and I just think they're writing about religion, but they don't know anything about religion, and that could be counterproductive. The third and final thing I have is that I think we need more institutional collaboration between the universities. So for example, if a student wanted to study Hinduism, they would be better off going somewhere outside of New Zealand. We have Will and we have Rick Weiss, but they're at different universities. But we could probably provide more effective training if there was some kind of way to co-supervise across these universities. And as far as I can tell, outside of Jeff Troughton, there are no permanent members of staff that were trained in New Zealand, and Jeff's PhD was in history. So we don't have the sort of capability of producing our own, and I think that's really important for the future. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, John. Yes. Our fourth and final speaker is Ben Schonthal, who is Associate Professor of Buddhism and Asian Religions at University of Otago, where, as you heard mentioned, the staff is also taking on a lot of administrative positions. So Ben is also the Associate Dean of the Humanities Division. His research examines the intersections of religion, law, and politics in late colonial and contemporary Southern Asia, with a particular focus on Buddhism and law in Sri Lanka. He's the author of a recent book out from Cambridge University Press called Buddhism, Politics, and the Limits of Law. Ben, I know you didn't think you would go long, but everybody's using at least their full 10 minutes, so I will have the timer on because it's now 2:05 my time. We only have 25 minutes left, so we're going to have very limited time for discussion.
Absolutely. No, thank you. I won't go long. Much of what I plan to say has actually already been said, I've noted, especially there, John finished up some of the last points I think that were unique. But I just want to start off by thanking Anne and Tim and Satoko, and to say that for a perspective of those of us at Otago and in New Zealand, it's wonderful for us to have a kind of a more formal ongoing contact with the IAHR, and despite the fact that we're disappointed not to be able to host the conference, we hope this can be ongoing. The comments I was going to make are basically reflections on the field, coming from, on the one hand, my training in North America in a certain type of religious studies. I graduated with my PhD from one of the few places that still has a program in history of religions, although in that nomenclature may change. And I've actually had the good fortune to work in New Zealand in religious studies in sort of three different ways over the last, I guess, well, 20 years, a little over 20 years. I initially actually came to the University of Otago as a study abroad student, as an undergraduate, and in a wonderful twist of fate, became very passionate about the study of religion by taking a class on what was then called Islamic spirituality from someone who is now my colleague, Greg Dawes. And it was actually that class that really solidified my commitment to pursuing higher education in this area. I then, while I was writing up my PhD, after doing my field research, had the good fortune to teach for 2.5 years at Victoria University, as a teaching replacement, while Rick Weiss had a large grant, and to work with Paul and the team over there. And then most recently in 2013 till now, to work alongside Will, and then John and Joseph, and Greg and Dean and Elizabeth and others there. So the reflections come from this perspective. And I think just in the interest of time, I really want to boil down the things that I was going to reflect on to a dynamic that I see very much at play in New Zealand, which could be described as a kind of schizophrenia in our attitude toward the study of religion here. And I think that the schizophrenia consists of the fact that we're constantly looking two ways in New Zealand. On the one hand, we're looking to the IAHR, to the advances in the study of religion in the academy, to high level debates, to our colleagues overseas. We have a real anxiety to make sure that we're not forgotten, and to, I think a lot of people in New Zealand sort of maybe have a real keen sense to publish widely and in high impact places, so that people don't forget that they exist. You know, that we go to conferences, we do these things for fear that people may not remember that we're down here. But on the other hand, we also have a schizophrenia or a focus on attracting students in New Zealand to our classes. And often these two folks push us in different directions, and I just want to point to a couple of places in which they do that. If our focus on the academic study of New Zealand and the academic study of religion in a big frame focuses us on thinking about the field as a field of a comprehensive field, a field that should be developing scholars in a broad way, it leads us to think that in New Zealand we should be offering a full range of classes that train students in all the different traditions, major world religions traditions. So when I first came to New Zealand, and indeed when I taught at Vic initially in the sort of 2010s, early 2010s, this was largely the case. Victoria University in 2011, for example, had someone who was an expert on Islam, someone who's an expert on Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism. They had even, experts in global Christianity and other things. And indeed, when I came to Otago, there was at least an aspiration in that direction. There was a Islamic studies major. We had someone who taught Islam. But what I've seen over the short time I've been here is that instinct to make sure that we had broad coverage, both at an institutional and a national level, has eroded in favor of trying to have classes that are more attractive to students. So we've seen a shift away from discipline-specific classes to classes such as, religion and politics, or religion and violence, or religion and development, which is great in one sense in that we're, doing away with the world religions model. But on the other hand, is I think coming at the expense of having having a comprehensive and I think, academically diverse set of specialties in the country, in the departments and in the country as a whole. So I think that's a conversation that we need to have in New Zealand. We at the moment, there's no permanent full-time staff member teaching Islam in New Zealand that I'm aware of, or whose primary specialty is Islam. That's a conversation I think we need to have. A similar conversation we need to have is around languages. So I came from a program where you could have called it as much a philology program as a religious studies program. And indeed, I think most of us in the academy here think that philology is important and language study is very important. but we just don't, even when we do have the resources to teach it, we taught Sanskrit here for a number of years, we can't seem to attract the student interest to sustain it. And so it would be something that we would have to invest in, and would be a kind of a risky gamble for us to undertake at a departmental level. But on the other hand, I think we all are vexed at the fact that we recognize that, fully trained, highly competent graduates in the field need to have language competency. And so this push-pull between wanting to look towards the IAHR, to look toward the international study of religion, and also to make sure we have enough students in our classes to keep our budgets steady. This is playing out the level of languages too. And the third thing I just mention here is that the final thing is that we're also, I think, a little bit stuck, although thanks to people like Paul Morris, not less so, between wanting to think of ourselves as a important field in the academy whose value is self-evident and who sits naturally, who doesn't need to advertise its value to the public. And on the other hand, really trying to make an effort to articulate why religious studies is important in the public sphere in New Zealand. So Paul has done a lot of work, reaching out to government, reaching out to schools, reaching out to even, the police about education and religious diversity. But I don't think all of us have. I think, in fact, I think Paul is more the exception than the rule. And this is something I do think that religious studies will need to do going forward, perhaps at the expense of some of our other goals, in order to make sure that we, whether or not we like it, we continue to have visibility and we continue to be considered an important academic discipline in a education system which is publicly funded and constantly reviewed for those funds. So that's just the short things I wanted to say, but I look forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Wait a minute. There. Okay. Thank you, Ben, I said, while muted. You came in a couple minutes under. So I think rather than try and pull together some sort of response, because time is pretty short right now, why don't we open it for questions, and I'll help out with questions if people are not chock full of questions. But do we have anybody who'd like to launch us off with something?
I'd be really keen to hear from some of the other New Zealand scholars who are signed in, Chris van der Krocht and Will Hovard, and their reflections on what we've said or the wider discipline, but not to prevent other people asking questions either.
Yeah, that sounds great. Chris or Will, do you have something you'd like to add? You're both muted.
Mute. Yes, I'm impressed by the way the speakers have come from quite different angles, and yet in each one I've heard echoes of my own experience of religious studies in New Zealand. It's there is as Ben was emphasising, there is this very strong tension between the demands of the discipline and the need to attract students and funding. One of the things I was struck by with Ben's presentation was this tension between needing to have graduates who've got an all-round familiarity with the greater traditions, and on the other hand, offering specialist courses. Do you think, Ben or anyone else, does that work? If you have these more specialized courses or thematic courses, shall we say, in order to, religion and violence, religion and sex and all that kind of thing, do the people doing those courses, do they end up with a rounded knowledge of the traditions, or do they just come out with only a few sort of slanted understandings, shall we say?
Ben, I think that was addressed to you.
Yeah.
I'm happy to let Paul or Will answer that question. My own intuition is that no, I think in some ways that if we are too quick in doing away with the discipline-specific courses, that the knowledge isn't the kind of deep, comprehensive knowledge that we should expect from our graduates. But I think it's also very clear that we limit the numbers of students that we get in some of those courses. But I'd like to hear from others.
I think it depends what the student does afterwards. Obviously, if they take the one paper, then no, it doesn't. But a lot of the students come into our program through those kinds of papers and then go back and take this is an oddity of the New Zealand system, which took me a while to realize, is that a student can take a first-year paper in any year of their degree, including in some cases the 5th or 6th year of their degree, if they're doing a double degree in humanities and law or something like that. So they will often go back and take the foundation courses, having come in through one of these thematic approaches. But a lot of them, of course, don't. They take 1 or 2 courses. It's also, I mean, we've been a little bit surprised. We surveyed our students a couple of years ago to find out what kind of courses they would like to see. And one of the most popular courses was a course on ancient religion, which I think was actually the person who proposed it modeled it on one of your papers, Chris, who he had tutored on it at Massey and said it was popular at Massey. And we put it on, and lo and behold, it's been our most popular course in the last 20 years. In fact, even longer than that, I think. We had 150 students taking a course on, Mesopotamian religion, Egyptian religion. So I personally was very surprised by that. I mean, that you would think of that as a kind of core foundational course dealing with some fairly abstruse materials, but it was very, very popular. So it's not always the case that the things we think students are going to enjoy is what they do enjoy.
Yeah, yeah. I of course took that over from Brian Collis. But when you think of ancient Egypt, if you look at the History Channel or something like that, if that's any gauge of popularity, then yeah, ancient Egypt is one of the most popular topics. I would have thought.
So Will, not Sweetman, the other one. Did you want to say anything?
Just quickly, I thank you all. It was really nice to hear from you, and some of you I haven't heard from in a long time, and it's nice to hear what you're thinking. It's nice to see people like Tim as well, who I haven't seen in a long time. I wanted to just add to John's comment about diversity. My experience is that most students in religious studies in New Zealand tend to be female rather than male, and we've for a long time had male staff. So I was looking for interesting, if you have any kind of observations on your experience and why we haven't been able to retain or develop female New Zealand academics in this space. And the second thing is, where are we in 20 years, I guess? I mean, there's been a story here of decline and kind of some shreds of hope. What does the next 20 years look like, ideally?
Is that a question for everyone on the panel?
I think so, whoever would like to answer.
I'm happy to speak a little bit to that. I mean, I think what you say is true. Most of our students here, the majority, are female. It's important that we make efforts to shift the demographic of the lecturing staff, and we are doing that. Specifically on the question about Māori, we have actually had a Māori staff member who we offered a fixed-term position, a 2-year position. She's now gone on to a position in Canada in teaching in I think partly an Indigenous Studies program. And we have another Māori staff member at the moment, also on a fixed-term position. He's in a very unusual situation. He's somebody who only discovered he was adopted and only discovered he was Māori fairly recently through DNA testing. So that's been a very interesting story. But I think what we were being encouraged to do at Otago is to identify Māori students who have the talent and to help foster them. And we have been making efforts to do that. Again, it's a small scale initiative and it's spotty, but I think in 20 years time, I don't think we'll be talking about the same situation. But at the same time, we're under all the other pressures that people have spoken about to ensure that one of the things I think that is absolutely key to the success of religious studies, wherever it has been successful in New Zealand, is outstanding teaching. It sounds glib to say that, but if you want to attract students, teach well, care about your students. And I think insofar as we've been successful at Otago, And from what I hear about, other programs, that was something which was absolutely key. The feeling that students wanted to come to lectures because the teaching was, and that means that you have to, there's a limit to what you can do in terms of both what you offer and who teaches it.
Yeah, Paul.
Can I just come in? I found the discussion and the presentations, heartening, and myself horribly in agreement with almost everything that's been said. I think the 20-year question comes back to Ben's articulation, which is we actually need a way of expressing and articulating the significance of religious studies within the context of New Zealand higher education, tertiary education. And doing that has been problematic because it isn't an off-the-shelf answer globally. It has to be contextualized in terms of biculturalism. It has to be contextualized in terms of, I thought Will overstated the secularity, but of New Zealanders. They're often intensely religious, but not in very pragmatic ways. And the breakdown of traditions, the survey I've just done for the Ministry of Education, the breakdown of traditions, is a reality for increasing numbers of people in Aotearoa, New Zealand. They aren't traditionalists in any sense, but see religion as very, very significant for them. I ought to just add in the survey that the New Age is finally over, at least by the respondents we had. Almost no one's interested in the New Age. So, but they are interested in religion, but they're deinstitutionalized, and they're not interested in mastering traditions in the way in which I was trained and you were trained, and I still think is significant. I just wanted to two things and a very quick word about education. I agree totally with John about a lot of the stuff I read about evolution and religion by people who don't know much about religion, and I think that's really significant and worth repeating over and over again. And Will, there's a really good historic reason why people were opposed to religion and theology at Auckland, and I'll tell you about it. It's a great story some other time. The survey I've just done for the Ministry of Education is to open the conversation about religious studies in New Zealand schools. The results will be available next month. What is significant is that there is a real momentum towards the teaching of religious education in schools, some sort of religious studies program, non-confessional religion in schools, which may have, hopefully will have a very positive impact on the future. It will depend on a particular party winning the election, but anyway, that's another concern and issue for this work to be developed. So there's real movement on that front. And from the survey, New Zealand parents want their children to know about different religions, but also about non-religious worldviews. And that came up very evidently in the survey. There is a very small core of people who are intensely religious. There's a very, a slightly larger but equally insignificant overall of Richard Dawkins' atheists, and a huge numbers of New Zealanders in the middle who understand that religion might be significant. On the last thing I want to say was just about the public profile of religion. There's now a minister as a point of contact for religion, and the work done by the Office of Ethnic Communities in the last year has been incredibly significant at engaging religious communities on the ground. The next phase of that should include engaging scholars of religion, and so I think the current government has been very open to both the realities and the study of religion. So these are, I'm trying to end on a much more positive note, but I do think we do need to carve out a place, I see it as beyond intersectionality, for the study of religion and its value in this very, very specific Aotearoa New Zealand context.
So, thank you, Paul. I'd like to squeeze in one last question before we turn it over to Tim. So Steve?
Oh, right. Oh, yeah. Hi there. Well, it's interesting to reflect on this from a Scottish UK context. Many of the things that you're saying sound very familiar to me. I mean, I think that one of the tensions in the field is something we have to work harder at to resolve, which is a tension between, naturalist and culturalist analyses of religions. I'm hearing biological and cognitivist accounts of religion, which I've been very sympathetic to, but I've also noticed, coming myself from a culturalist, historical, ethnographical background, is in some tension in the institutionalization of our field and how we take that forward. So in some ways, I think we're in a kind of interregnum after the Smartian phenomenology of religion and a post-Smartian consensus where we have some kind of more centripetal focus on what we can gather us together in our studies, towards theoretical and comparative aims, so we can ward off those who will just, deconstruct religion ad nauseum, but we can also ward off a kind of flight to ultra specialisms, whether in the natural sciences or in the ethnographic pursuits. So I think we've got a kind of disciplinary problem that is kind of probably universal across countries. But I think we also have to kind of work out, what our studies are for, who our audiences are for outside of the universities. In the UK, it's clear that many of our undergraduates and increasingly postgraduates are coming to religious studies because they've got questions about religion, personal questions, all that kind of thing, rather than solving, JZ Smithian analytical, intellectual questions about culture and society. And we might wish perhaps that was different, but that's where we're at. But how do we kind of, if you like, partly work with these folks, but also try and encourage wider audiences to see that the study of religion, has a kind of good in an enlightenment or post-enlightenment sense that isn't just predicated on personal solutions or political solutions as well. So I think, that's a big picture and a lot of observations there. Sorry, it's late at night here in the UK. But I think, we're in this interregnum where we have to keep working, I think, across our disciplinary specialisms to craft some kind of consensus in the comparative and theoretically oriented study of religions that we can also sell to wider society.
Thank you. That's a nice note to wrap things up on as well. So Tim, I've managed to carve out a few minutes for you to do a concluding few words.
Thank you to Paul, Will, Ben and Anne, as well as to the other participants present. I apologize for arriving to this webinar a bit too late. My mind and body somehow tricked me into thinking that it was tomorrow night, the 17th my time, and then it turned out to be tonight. Well, I am, however, pleased that I made it even a bit late, and I'm happy that we managed to set up this roundtable webinar. Though a poor substitute for a week of IAHR World Congress Spotlight on the study of religion and scholarship on religion in Aotearoa, New Zealand, it is certainly better than nothing. So thank you to all of you and to Satoko and Will in particular for making it possible. I really would have liked also to congratulate in public the NASA, the New Zealand Association for the Study of Religion, with its 2020 50th anniversary and its 25th anniversary as a member to the IAHR. But all I can do now is to say that I'm truly happy that the NZASR is a member, and I hope that the IAHR has been and in the future will be of some support. The presentations and discussion have been very interesting to me as a person who has been and still is deeply engaged in promoting the academic study of religion. not just within the academia, but also in the wider society. And by the way, also of religious education based on the study of religion in schools. Something you touched upon in the discussion too. Paul, together with Joseph Bulbulia, who unfortunately is not with us tonight, back in 2004 edited a publication linked to the 2002 IAHR conference in Wellington. The theme and the title was, "What is Religion for?" Tonight, I think you have been discussing inter alia, what is the study of religion good for? And I can tell you that I think that one of the tasks of the IAHR in the years ahead will be to not just promote the academic study of religion within academia, but also within the wider society. Inter alia by way of promoting a study of religion-based religious education, something a new working group in the IAHR is supposed to take issue with. I also think, and I say this with reference to what Stephen just said, and also to his use of the terms naturalist and culturalist approaches, that the IAHR may help reconcile naturalist and culturalist approaches, and with special regard to the public demand, combine the two. In my opinion, public demand, however, will be most likely for culturalist rather than naturalist approaches to religion. But our task, and the task of the IAHR, I think, is to also promote naturalist approaches and to tell people and the public that the value of a scientific study of religion is exactly to be scientific on top of everything else, and that also means to promote naturalist approaches. The IAHR leadership has already started to tackle such kind of issues. For instance, at the meeting in Delphi in 2019, and Will was there. And I think that in the coming years, we shall have to discuss how we can best tell everybody, not only scholars, but also politicians, that the study of religion is of value to society at large, not least, as said, exactly because of its scientific approach to religion. In tonight's discussion, you also touched upon another issue that I find of great importance to the IAHR, namely how to combine studies in contemporary religion with studies on ancient religions. How do we keep students interested in doing philological, historical studies, and not just studies in, for instance, religion and politics, religion and human rights, religion and sex, etc. We need to have students also in the future who can master historical and comparative studies. But it is difficult. It's very difficult for a lot of reasons. I thought, thank you for contributing to these discussions, a challenge or challenges to all of us, and not just to the study of religion in New Zealand. And not least, allow me to thank each and all of you for your extremely hard work on the preparation of the Otago 2020 IAHR World Congress. That work started not just with your 2016 bid for hosting it. It started, as Will knows well, already in Toronto in 2010. You have all been working so hard on this that I cannot find words to clearly express how much the IAHR leadership has appreciated your work and how deeply we regret that it did not work out as planned. So, take my word for this. The IAHR will stay in close contact with scholars and scholarship in New Zealand also in the future. See you all sooner than later. Thank you.